Senator Tom Cotton of Arkansas. Let's put aside the New Hampshire primary for a little bit. By the way, Senator, I understand that Arkansas shuts down whenever there's 1 inch of snow. What would happen if they had a real snowstorm in Arkansas?
Well, let's just hope that Hugh Hewitt is not stranded there when they get a few flakes of snow, since he would apparently have to bundle up in a hotel with his mitten and hot cocoa and not get to work on time.
I wanted John Campbell to have a few extra reps to stay in shape. I could have made it to the show yesterday, but John Allen is with me. I want to remind you of that. Senator Cotton, he'll ask you a question. But before the show began, long before the polls closed, before the results were coming in, we noted that you were on the floor of the Senate today talking about criminal justice reform. What's that all about?
Yeah, Hugh, there's a movement in Washington to let thousands of violent felons out of federal prison. This legislation, which passed out of the Senate Judiciary Committee last year, is built on a myth, the myth of mass incarceration of low-level, nonviolent, first-time drug offenders in federal prison. That is simply not the case. The federal prison population, first, only accounts for 1/8 of all prisoners in this country. Second, less than 0.5% of federal prisoners are in prison for mere possession or something similar. And third, even those most likely pleaded down from a more serious trafficking or dealing offense. So it's simply a myth that there is a lot of prisoners in the federal system who are mere users or addicts. I, for one, don't want to see a mere user or an addict go to prison. I'd rather see that person get treatment. But that's not the case in the federal system. And the legislation, as drafted by the Senate Judiciary Committee, would let thousands of drug traffickers and dealers and other violent felons back onto the street. And we know, as a statistical matter, that they will commit heinous atrocities, as just happened last month, when a federal prisoner who was released early under previous reductions by the Sentencing Commission stabbed to death his ex-girlfriend and her 2 young daughters. I don't want to see something like that happen. I don't think many of your listeners want to see something like that happen. There are other reforms we could undertake to our criminal justice system to promote rehabilitation and drug treatment and prison reform and the overcriminalization of private conduct, but we shouldn't let out thousands of hardened felons.
And Senator Cotton, you've introduced this Criminal Consequences of Early Release Act. This is John Allen from Sidewire, basically to ask for the collection of data, I think, to make sure, to basically look at recidivism rates. I'm curious how you end up fighting what seems like an uphill battle right now, because you've got so many Republicans and Democrats coming together for this idea of sentencing reform. It feels like you might be rowing against the tide.
Well, John, we just had 46,000 felons become eligible for early release from the federal system under 3 previous sentencing reductions by the Sentencing Commission. I think it'd be a smart idea to hit pause, take stock of what happens with those felons before the Congress passes an even more sweeping criminal leniency bill. Again, there are things we could do to reform our criminal justice system, to promote greater rehabilitation and drug treatment and prison reform. But I don't think we should release thousands of violent felons from federal prison. And as I have found in my conversations with other senators who don't sit on the Judiciary Committee, who have not studied the bill closely, they are very surprised to learn about the facts that there aren't any mere possession offenses in federal prison by and large. They're surprised to learn the number of hardened felons that would be released by the legislation as it was drafted by the Senate Judiciary Committee. So I actually think that we have momentum on our side to stop this very unwise bill. And in fact, the proponents of this legislation just announced this week that they would be changing their bill in certain matters. I haven't reviewed that text. I'm happy to do so. I'm glad to see that they recognize that the bill as passed through committee would in fact release thousands of violent felons.
Why do you think Congress has had such a hard time in this area? There was the big push for a crime bill during the Clinton years, a lot of cracking down on crime, the effort to put more people behind bars. We've seen the pendulum switch back on that in terms of the politics, trying to get treatment for folks instead of, as you were talking about, instead of prison for folks who are low-level drug offenders. And now this... the way that that's being crafted, as you suggest, may be overly broad and let a lot of people out who shouldn't be let out. Why does Congress have such a hard time finding the right spot on this issue?
John, I can't really analyze what happened before I arrived here and some of what happened when I was a young boy and teenager, but I can talk about the statistics here. I mean, for a generation, going back to the late 80s to early 90s, thanks to the work of path-breaking scholars like Jim Wilson, who developed the broken windows policing model, and leaders like Rudy Giuliani, who implemented that, as well as tougher sentencing and reductions in judicial discretion in sentencing, we've seen the violent crime rate drop dramatically over the last generation. That is a huge social policy success in this country. Unfortunately, as the police have been stigmatized over the last 2 years for doing their jobs in many cases, and as the Sentencing Commission in many states have begun to roll back tough sentencing laws, we've seen an increase in violent crime in this country. I want to make sure that stops in its tracks. I don't want to give up the hard-won successes of the last generation and lead to more violent crime on our streets. It is the most fundamental responsibility of any government to care for the safety and security of its people. That's not just a matter of national security, but that's a matter of law and order on our streets.
Now, Senator Cotton, Hugh again, Saturday night's debate dominated by a lot of sort of chapters, one chapter of which was Ted Cruz telling the story of his sister's addiction. Carly Fiorina has spoken movingly about her stepdaughter's addiction and death. Despite her disappointing results tonight, I'm sure she's going to carry on and keep talking about things like that. But the drug epidemic in America, especially heroin, prescription painkillers, has touched a lot of people's families. Is that what's really going on here? We have a minute left. Is that what is really behind the let people out of jail free card, is that they feel that the addiction problem has overwhelmed our ability to cope with it?
Well, drug addiction, especially heroin, has been increasing in this country, and there is a heroin epidemic. I would say that is predominantly driven by the supply side and by failed Obama administration enforcement policies. But regardless, there is a rising heroin epidemic, and that has touched many families, many communities, so senators and congressmen hear that. And I suspect, like me, like the proponents of this bill, not many congressmen and senators want to see users and addicts locked up. They want to see them treated. But that's not what this bill does.
Senator Tom Cotton, thank you for joining us.